Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive on the economic future of low-income countries. Yeah, it's a pretty crucial topic and, frankly, a little bit concerning. So we'll be breaking down the World Bank's January 2025 Global Economic Prospects Report. And let me tell you, it's got a ton of eye-opening stuff in there. So we're going to try to figure out why fewer countries are making it to middle-income status,
Yeah.
what kind of roadblocks they're running into, and if there's any light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, this report definitely doesn't sugarcoat anything. The World Bank really just lays it all out there. The reality is there's a slowdown in what they call graduations. At the start of the century, there were 63 low-income countries. Since then, 39 have reached middle-income status, which is fantastic. But the rest, well, their inflation-adjusted GDP per capita has been basically flat for the past 15 years.
Wow, so they're not just progressing slower than we'd like, they're practically at a standstill. That's got to have some serious consequences. But before we get into all that, can you remind me why this whole graduation thing, why is reaching middle income status such a big deal?
It's not just about like a bigger paycheck. Graduating means improvements across the board. Better healthcare, more kids in school, reliable electricity. You know, it's about lifting millions of people out of poverty and giving them a real shot at a better future.
Gotcha. So it's more like a marker of overall progress. Now, the report compares today's low income countries with the ones that already graduated. They call those the LTMs, or low income turned middle income. What's the picture like there?
Honestly, not great. Today's low-income countries are lagging behind where the LTMs were back in 2000 across a bunch of crucial development indicators, like secondary school enrollment, for instance, and access to electricity. That kind of basic stuff you need for a strong economy. They're also dealing with way higher poverty rates.
So they're kind of starting off at a disadvantage compared to the ones who've already made it. And the report points to conflict, debt, and weak institutions as
Huh.
this like dangerous cycle holding them back.
It really is a tragic cycle. Conflict just leads to poverty and instability, which makes it incredibly hard to build up good governance and attract the kind of investment you need for development. It's like you're trying to climb out of a hole with a broken ladder, you know?
Yeah, I get that. And speaking of burdens, the report says that over half of these low-income countries are either drowning in debt or at high risk of it. That's got to make it almost impossible to invest in the future, right?
Absolutely. And to make matters worse, global interest rates are going up,
Right.
which makes borrowing even more expensive. So it's like adding weights to someone who's already struggling to stay afloat.
Yeah, I'm starting to see just how tough this climb really is. And when we look at per capita income growth, the numbers are kind of alarming. The report compares the first decade of the century, where low-income countries averaged about 2.2% annual growth, to the past 15 years, where it's dropped to less than 0.1%. I mean, is that even growth at that point?
Barely. All this lost potential has a huge human cost. When economies stagnate, it crushes hope for a better life and traps millions of people in poverty. It's like hitting pause on progress. And for some, it probably feels like going backwards.
Okay, so we've painted a pretty bleak picture here. Is there any good news? Any reason for optimism at all?
It's not all doom and gloom. Remember, there are countries that successfully made it to middle-income status. And those success stories give us valuable insights.
Okay, I'm listening. What can we learn from the ones who made it? What's the secret sauce?
Well, the report talks about something called growth accelerations. Basically, these are extended periods of strong economic expansion. And they're a common thread in a lot of the success stories. It's not just a temporary boost, it's sustained growth that creates this positive feedback loop. More investment, more jobs, better living standards, the whole package.
So they're not just hitting the gas pedals, they're keeping it down for a good long while. But what makes these growth accelerations happen in the first place?
One of the key things is a major increase in investment, both from the public and private sectors. We're talking about building the foundations of a strong economy, investing in infrastructure, education, key industries.
So creating the right conditions for businesses to thrive and for people to actually prosper. I imagine having stable policies plays a big role too, right?
Absolutely. Investors, both domestic and foreign, they need to know the rules of the game aren't going to change out of nowhere. That means clear regulations, a fair legal system, and a real commitment to tackling corruption. It's about creating a level playing field so that everyone can innovate and take risks.
Makes sense. But it can't just be about attracting outside investment. What about the people who are already there?
You got it. Nurturing local entrepreneurship and innovation is huge. It's about creating an environment where local businesses can flourish so they can create jobs and drive economic growth from within.
So empowering people to build their own futures. I like that. But we can't ignore the skills gap, can we? How do these countries make sure their workforce has the right skills for the future?
Education and training are essential, especially in the fields that are in high demand globally. It's about giving people the skills and knowledge to really thrive in an increasingly connected world.
So giving people the tools to not just survive, but to actually succeed in a world that's constantly changing. Now, something we haven't talked about much is climate change. I have to imagine that's a big factor for a lot of these countries, especially with their reliance on agriculture and natural resources.
Oh, absolutely. Climate change is a threat multiplier. It makes existing problems worse and creates whole new ones. These countries need to prioritize investments in climate-resilient infrastructure, sustainable agriculture, renewable energy, all that.
So basically, building a future that's not just prosperous, but also environmentally sustainable. It's a massive task, and it seems like they're being asked to do all this while they're already struggling just to meet basic needs. Can they realistically pull this off without help?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, no, they can't do it alone. The international community has to step up and provide support, both through increased development assistance and trade policies that create a fairer system.
So it's not just about charity then, it's about recognizing that we're all connected and working together to build a global economy that's more just and equitable.
Exactly. We all benefit when everyone has a chance to succeed. But let's be real, this is going to take some serious effort from everybody.
Well, I'm definitely ready to dive deeper into what that effort looks like. What can the international community actually do to help these countries reach their goals? All right, so let's dig into those obstacles. The report's pretty upfront about the tough realities these countries are facing.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the biggest ones is that whole vicious cycle of conflict and fragility.
Hmm.
It's like, imagine trying to build a solid economy in a place where there's constant conflict. It's almost impossible. Conflict disrupts everything, destroys infrastructure, creates massive instability. It's like trying to plant a garden in the middle of an earthquake.
Right, yeah. It's just heartbreaking to think about the human cost of all that conflict and the setbacks it causes for these economies. But even in places that aren't directly affected by war, there are other challenges too, right? Like political instability, corruption.
Yeah.
Those things have got to make it tough to attract investment and grow.
Oh, absolutely. A volatile political scene with weak governance can be just as damaging as actual fighting. It creates uncertainty, breeds corruption, and it scares off investors, both domestic and foreign. It's like building a house on a foundation of sand. It's just not going to hold up.
And of course, we can't forget about the elephant in the room, that massive debt burden so many of these countries are carrying. I mean, how can they even think about investing in their future when they're struggling just to keep their heads above water?
It's a huge issue. Many of these countries are just crippled by high levels of debt, often with terms that are really unfavorable. And it prevents them from investing in education, healthcare, infrastructure, the very things they need to grow and prosper. It's a real catch-22.
So they're trapped in this debt spiral with no way out. And to make things even worse, the report mentions how vulnerable these countries are to global commodity price swings. I bet that makes economic planning a nightmare.
Oh, tell me about it. A lot of these economies depend heavily on exporting raw materials. So when prices tank, their revenue takes a nosedive. It's like you build your house on the edge of a cliff and just hope there isn't an earthquake. Not exactly the best strategy for stability.
Okay, so we've got conflict, weak governance, crushing debt, and on top of all that, exposure to these volatile global markets. It sounds pretty overwhelming. Is there anything these countries can do to break free from the cycle?
Well, the challenges are definitely significant, but I wouldn't say they're insurmountable. The report actually lays out a roadmap for action, both for the low-income countries themselves and for the international community. It's going to take a combination of smart policies at home and strong support from the rest of the world.
Okay, I'm interested to hear more about this roadmap. What are some of the specific things these countries can do to build a more stable and prosperous future for themselves?
Well, the first thing is to establish a stable macroeconomic environment. That means getting inflation under control, managing debt levels responsibly, and creating a fiscal framework that can handle those economic ups and downs.
So basically laying a strong foundation, making sure the house is built on solid ground this time.
Exactly. And then they need to focus on those structural reforms, the ones that make it easier to do business, attract investment, and boost productivity. Things like streamlined regulations, cracking down on corruption, and building a legal system that's strong and reliable.
So creating a space where both local and foreign businesses can thrive. But what about tapping into the potential that's already there in these countries?
Absolutely. Supporting entrepreneurship and innovation is critical. It's all about creating an environment where those local businesses can flourish. They can create jobs and drive economic growth from within.
So empowering people to take charge of their own futures. I like that. But we got to talk about the skills gap too. How do these countries make sure their workforce has the right skills for what's coming next?
Yeah, education and training are absolutely essential, especially in fields that are in high demand globally. We need to equip people with the skills and knowledge to really make it in an increasingly interconnected world.
So giving them the tools not just to survive, but to really thrive. Now, we haven't really touched on climate change much, but I have to imagine that's a major factor for a lot of these countries, especially since so many of them rely on agriculture and natural resources.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Climate change is like a threat multiplier. It makes all the existing problems worse and throws a bunch of new ones into the mix. So these countries really need to prioritize investments in climate-resilient infrastructure, sustainable agriculture, renewable energy, that whole suite of solutions.
So building a future that's not just prosperous, but also environmentally sustainable. It's a tall order. And it seems like they're being asked to do all this. While they're already struggling to meet basic needs, can they really pull this off without help?
That's the key question.
Yeah.
And honestly, I don't think they can. The international community has a responsibility to step up and provide support, both through things like increased development assistance and through trade policies that create a more level playing field.
So it's not just about charity. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together and working together to build a global economy that's more just and equitable.
Precisely. Everyone benefits when everyone has a chance to succeed. But let's be real, this is going to take some serious effort from all of us.
I'm ready to get into the specifics of that effort. What can the international community actually do to support these countries and help them achieve their goals? So let's get down to brass tacks here. What can the international community actually do to help tip the scales in these countries' favor? It seems like a pretty huge task.
It is, but there are definitely concrete steps that can make a difference. First off, we have to talk about development assistance. Developed countries need to increase their financial contributions. And it's not just about throwing money at the problem. This aid needs to be targeted effectively, focusing on areas like infrastructure, education, and healthcare.
Right, so it's about making sure those funds are actually used wisely to create real lasting change. But aid alone can't fix everything, can it?
No, absolutely not. We also need to address trade. Fair trade policies that actually give these countries access to global markets are essential. We can't be talking about economic development while at the same time putting up trade barriers that prevent them from competing fairly.
Yeah, that's like telling someone to learn to swim and then throwing them in the ocean with their hands tied. It just doesn't make any sense. So beyond aid and trade, what else can be done to tackle some of the deeper, more systemic issues? Things like debt relief and dealing with corruption.
Those are both crucial too. Debt relief can give these countries some much-needed breathing room, so they can actually invest in their own development.
Yeah.
And tackling corruption, both domestically and internationally, is absolutely essential. It's about making sure resources are used for their intended purpose, not just disappearing into the pockets of the powerful.
So creating a system that genuinely supports sustainable development, not one that just keeps perpetuating poverty and inequality. It seems like there's more and more awareness of these issues these days. But actually turning that awareness into action, that's the tough part.
Yeah, it can be. But there are some encouraging signs.
Right.
We're seeing a shift towards a more holistic approach to development now, one that recognizes that all these issues are connected. And there's a growing understanding of how important local ownership and leadership are. It's not about imposing solutions from the outside. It's about giving these countries the power to chart their own course to prosperity.
So it's about partnership, collaboration, and a shared commitment to creating a world where everyone has a real chance to thrive. But let's circle back to the World Bank report for a second. In all the talk about challenges and potential solutions, were there any specific recommendations that stood out to you? Anything that gave you a sense of hope or pointed to a particularly effective way forward?
One recommendation that really resonated with me was the focus on investing in human capital, specifically through education and skills development. The report makes a strong case that this is one of the most powerful ways to drive long-term economic growth and social progress.
So basically, investing in people, giving them the tools and knowledge they need to create a better future for themselves and their communities. I love that. It feels so much more empowering than just giving handouts.
Exactly. And the report highlights how important it is to shift our mindset. both within these countries and internationally.
Yeah.
It's about moving away from this donor-recipient dynamic
Yeah.
and embracing a more collaborative approach, one that recognizes the agency and potential of these countries.
Seeing them as partners, not just beneficiaries. That change in perspective can make all the difference.
Absolutely. When we recognize the strengths and capabilities that these countries already have, that's when we can really start to unlock their true potential.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, the challenges, the possible solutions, and maybe most importantly, the resilience and potential of low-income countries. It's clear that there's no quick fix, but there's definitely reason to be hopeful.
I agree. It's a complex issue, no doubt, but it's also a really important one. And at the end of the day, it's a challenge we can overcome if we work together.
I think that's a great note to end on. You've given our listeners a lot to consider. The report gives us a realistic picture of the obstacles, but it also offers a path forward, a roadmap to a more just and prosperous world for everyone. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.